So, this is a conversation with Peter Pomerantsev. He's a writer and the author of two books, Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, and This is Not Propaganda. Among the many topics that we discuss in this episode are Russian disinformation on Ukraine and Syria, the Brexit campaign, the Trump presidency, Maria Resa's conviction in the Philippines, missed opportunities of Ukrainian-Syrian solidarity, 1990s Russia and the rise of Putin, pop-up populism, and how to deal with disinformation while being mindful of censorship fears. As usual, you can follow the podcast on Twitter at FridayStimes, and if you like what I do, please consider supporting this project with only $1 a month on Patreon on buymeacoffee.com, and you can also do so directly on PayPal if you prefer. Patreon is for monthly, PayPal is for one-offs, and Buy Me Coffee has both options. But if you cannot donate, you can still help by reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you.
My name's Peter Pomerantsev. I'm a writer first and foremost. I've written two books about the subject I think we'll be discussing today, about disinformation and propaganda and identity politics. One was about Russia, called Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. And the other one really about the state of information war in the whole world, which is called This is Not Propaganda. But I also run a research initiative at the London School of Economics and at Johns Hopkins Universities called ARENA, which kind of experiments with different ways we can overcome disinformation and polarization. And I do the odd bit of journalism as well.
Okay, so let's get into the two books. I've read both of them. I've quite enjoyed them. But for listeners who don't know, can we kind of go through like some of the main arguments and how did you, how and why did you start with Russia, and then with the second book is sort of like a more global overview of the situation.
So I lived in Russia for 10 years, between 2000 and 2010. And I did a lot of things. I was quite young then, but I largely worked in television. My background's not in writing. My background's in film and TV. And at the end of my time there, I'd realized that I'd really seen close up a new kind of propaganda model develop that was, we're talking about Russia, very different to the communist model. This was a propaganda model which didn't try to convince people about, some great ideology. Instead of just try to sow kind of cynicism and say that, well, there is no good out there. Everything is corrupt. The whole world is corrupt. So, Russia can just be as corrupt as anywhere else. And it didn't try to convince people so much as to sow doubt and uncertainty through disinformation and conspiracy theories. And it was a kind of, it was a propaganda model which didn't try to proclaim a glorious communist future, but which was kind of full of nostalgia for, a very misty past, and where all the effort was made into kind of constantly redefining the meaning of the people, which was constantly in flux. And it was a propaganda model where kind of ideological ideas of left and right had disappeared, where you had a liberal democratic party that was neither liberal nor democratic. You had a communist party, which was kind of, nationalist orthodox. And you had Putin as this kind of a man for all seasons. So he could be one thing for one group of people and another for another group of people. And perhaps most disturbingly, it was a system where you couldn't catch the powerful out with the truth. You couldn't hold truth, you couldn't hold truth to power, because the powerful didn't care if they were caught lying. They just laughed at factual language and made fun of it and reveled in lying. So I described this world in my first book, and I try to capture all of that in one phrase: nothing is true and everything is possible, which is the title of the book. And then I came back to the West, and lo and behold, I see so many of the same things start to manifest themselves throughout the West. And my second book was really powered by the desire to understand, why did the future arrive first in Russia? And are we seeing something systemic? And if it's something systemic, what can we do about it? And so the second book, I go around the world and I kind of look at the systemic reasons behind what's happening. And I look at the technological ones, and I look at the cultural ones, and I tell a lot of stories. I mean, the second book, I go to the Philippines and China and Latin America and Ukraine, and it's one of these run around the world books. And I come to a certain set of conclusions. What's going on? Why we're seeing the same thing, really in very different markets, if you're going to use that language. I mean, we see the same things happening in different forms with national characteristics, but really the same patterns playing out in all across the world. So the second book is, trying to understand why, and what do we do about it?
And so you mentioned that the future came first to Russia, and in some ways, this is a future where you're being told that there is no future. That's sort of part of the idea, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So the Futureless Presence, I think, is what I call it. Yeah.
Oh, that's a good term, yeah. Futureless Presence.
Yeah. And look, I don't think there's anything mysterious in that it came to Russia first. And also, look, there could well be other places where arrived at this place. But the place is a place where all the kind of Enlightenment, rational projects of the future have emptied themselves. So in Russia, obviously, people stopped believing in communism really during the Soviet Union. People have a very cynical attitude to it. And then really already in 93, I think 93 is a very important year for Russia. People, or a lot of people, not everyone, but enough people lose faith in kind of democratic capitalism. The reforms, after this period of euphoria in 89, by 93, democratic reforms are a mess. And that's really when you see the beginnings of this kind of political discourse and propaganda. Nostalgia sort of seeps through and takes over everything. Political language loses all meaning. And you see these figures emerge that really kind of anticipate Trump and Bolsonaro and all these other guys we now have in so many ways. People like Vladimir Zhirinovsky, who becomes a very popular politician at the time and is still going, who are kind of these jesters, but who revel in throwing up a middle finger to the facts. In the book, I go into a lot of detail how the political strategies that Russian spin doctors used in the 1990s, I'm not saying this is the same thing, but they anticipate the same kind of situation that spin doctors across the world now operate in. Because that sense of the future disappearing, there is no one moment when it takes hold in the West, but it kind of happens slowly. But obviously 2008 is a very big year. What happened in Iraq is a very big deal, I think, because that undermines the sense that democracy is a future that the whole world is moving towards. And we can talk about many things, and some of them are very simple, like people becoming aware their kids are going to be poorer than them. And we can talk about specific situations. I think in Eastern Europe you have this interesting situation where countries, their idea of the future in Poland or Hungary was getting into the EU. But once you've got in, what the hell do you do next? And so they get to take. So people reach the end, their own version of not being able to imagine a future in different ways. But what was interesting for me to see it happening in Latin America, where you'd also had a wave of democratization in the late 1980s and early 1990s, which has hit some sort of wall. Also in Southeast Asia, which was a story that I didn't know very well. But again, we always think of democratization happening in Eastern Europe, but it happened all across the world in late 80s and early 90s. And in countries throughout Southeast Asia, in the book I go to Manila, that sense of, that pro-democracy urge that starts in 1986 there, with the overthrow of the military dictator Marcos, has really hit a dead end, because of inequality, because of 1,000,001 factors that we know about. And now you have this leader Duterte in the Philippines who wants to bring Marcos back. So this seems to be something that is not just Russia and the West, but for very true for a lot of places.
There's definitely a global factor here. And here I would mention that Maria Resa, who's the co-founder of Rappler, she was charged a few days ago with cyber libel in the Philippines.
So she's one of the heroes of my book.
Yes.
and she's amazing because so for your listeners who don't know, she's a journalist who created a very good independent news agency, news site in the Philippines, and now she's under attack from the president there. But she's fascinating because she was for a long time an observer of things in that bit of the world, and she was a CNN sort of correspondent for Southeast Asia, and she told the story of its democratization. I mean, she was telling the story of Southeast Asia's 1989s as one government after the next becomes democratic in the region, and now she's become a victim of the rollback. So
yeah,
it's she's become the story, which is ironic and very sad and tragic.
yeah. For me, the concept of like nothing is true and everything is possible was actually pretty instinctual in a sense. I mean, I grew up in Lebanon, and our two bigger neighbors obviously are Israel and Syria. And for quite a while, we've had two. Long story short, I talk about this in other episodes, and don't want to get too much into details, but there were two coexisting military occupations of Lebanon at the same time for almost 2 decades. And part of the reality of growing up in that setting is that in some ways it becomes this invisible force. I mean, obviously they have to reinforce it, and there are lots of horrors and atrocities that I get into in other episodes. But growing up in this background, in a sense, it became even easier for me to then, when I started focusing on Syria, which I started doing around 2013, to sort of see all of the baggage in a sense that I grew up with, but I wasn't really understanding beforehand. And Syria obviously is a link here because the massive campaigns of disinformation that we started seeing, I personally started noticing them around the time that Russia started bombing Syria. I then sort of later, I mean, around that same time, I learned that this was also happening during the annexation of Crimea, during the Maidan in Ukraine, and so on. And I wanted to ask you, well, first, I guess for those, I think most people would have a general idea of what I'm talking about. But for those who don't know, what is this specific format of disinformation that we started seeing? We started seeing them in the UK and in the US around 2016, of course, 2015, 2016. Whereas with, I believe with the Crimea is in 2014, and with Syria as well shortly after.
Oh, listen, it's a full spectrum disinformation campaign that goes right from official spokespeople, and it can even be Putin and Lavrov, the foreign minister, and the representative at the UN, down to the tiniest little bots on Twitter or weird accounts on Reddit. And what's interesting, it seems to be fairly coordinated, which is really quite stunning. Though if you know the history of Russian disinformation, it's not that stunning. This is something that has an old Soviet pedigree, but now it's been taken over to the digital age. And I mean, to put a cut a long story short, I mean, the aim is to astroturf an alternative reality. Plant micro story. Yeah, you plant. For those who don't know. You can plant micro stories in the weird corners of the internet. Then they're amplified, seemingly by a Russian news agency or a Russian proxy news agency. They'll go, oh, look at this interesting thing that we found. And so you create the disinformation, then you have your media amplify it, and then it can be taken right to the highest level. So it's given a lot of noise. So it's the whole thing. You're using official spokespeople, you're using planted disinformation online, fake documents, doctored photos, video evidence taken without context, or just sort of eyewitness reports from the ground which say the white helmets planted chemical weapons, but you just don't know who the hell put that story there. And I suppose what's this is very similar to what the Soviets did with their disinformation campaigns. They'd plant a fake piece of evidence somewhere in the information ecosystem and hope that it will get picked up or will get picked up by Soviet media itself. But now you can just do it very, very fast. You can do it at scale, and you can just create so much of it in really quite crass ways that people just give up. They get very, very confused. And we saw a lot of this in the during the war in Syria with disinformation about the Syrian opposition, about the white helmets, who are kind of humanitarian workers, and so on and so forth. And it's just it's the scale of it which is new, the pace that it can be created, and kind of the aim, which is as often not just to make people feel that they can never work out what the truth is. So the Russians were doing a lot of this in Ukraine when they invaded Ukraine, and they sort of repeated it with Syria. So there's been very good research by computer science researchers about the architecture of this.
So part of the reason why I wanted to talk to you as well, other than to introduce your two books to like the audience of this podcast, is I wanted to always to emphasize, and this is something that's very important because I think it's still very widely misunderstood, despite the fact that, as you said, there's quite a lot of research being done. There's not just a matter of dealing with fake news and then trying to convince people that this is fake news, but it's also the time that is spent. So I'll use my example here. As an activist who's obviously opposed to the Assad regime and who has this focus on Syria, at some point, especially around 2016, up until the point of the fall of Aleppo, that whole year was quite difficult, of course. A lot of time was spent by myself and especially by Syrian activists, including Syrian activists who were under the siege, so under the bombardment in eastern Aleppo. A lot of time was spent by this group of people trying to debunk conspiracy theories and disinformation and all of that it actually took away time that could be spent, let's say, lobbying for some kind of humanitarian solution, some ceasefire, something to be done. And so in some ways, it's kind of like the other side of the coin of nothing is true and everything is possible, because at this point, what ends up happening is that nothing is true and also nothing is possible. Is that it's really a collapse of the entire ecosystem, if you want, if that's the correct word to use. I'm not sure if that's the correct word to use, but I wanted to ask you, for those, from what I can tell so far, a big part of the audience would know at least the basics when it comes to Syria, but not necessarily when it comes to Ukraine. And so, as much as you can, what is the big deal? Why was it such a big thing for Maidan, Euromaidan, however you want to call it, to happen? And why was the reaction? There's the geopolitical aspect of why did the Russian government militarily invade Ukraine. That's one thing, and you can get into that if you want. But also, like on the disinformation level, how did the media outlets like Sputnik, like RT, the troll farms that are associated but are not necessarily the same thing, how did they sort of react to this movement, to this revolution? And how have they sort of developed since then? Is it kind of just the same model being applied in different places, or like have they learned in some ways to adapt to different situations?
I'm trying to summarize this very, very, very succinctly.
Sure.
I think one NATO general called it the greatest information blitzkrieg in history, or something like that. The information was a very targeted campaign in Ukraine. It wasn't random. It was there's several audiences they were working on. There's the Western audience, where there's a bunch of narratives that they use, which were repeated again. It's a full spectrum thing. It's repeated at the top. It's by troll farms, by media. There's lots and lots of levels to it, and they know their audience well. In that sense, it's a very contemporary marketing-based approach. They know that to the leftists you say, this is all because of NATO imperialism. And to the right wingers, you say, we're stopping LGBT and Euro values spreading in Ukraine. So you do a different message for different groups, knowing which audience will want what. So that's the first thing. But really, the main focus was on Ukraine itself, and there the aim was to make enough parts of the population in eastern Ukraine feel that their lives were in danger from people in Western Ukraine, that this was a fascist revolution of some sort, that this was sort of playing a lot of Second World War narratives, and that that they were in danger and that this was an attack on them, and encouraging them to follow the cause of separatism or to call for Putin to invade to protect them. That was a very big line. Sort of, there are gangs and violence all across Ukraine. Marauding right-wing gangs are out to get you. We need Putin. Putin, come and save us. Please come and invade. So that was kind of the, that was the main strategic narrative, which didn't hold for very long, but held for enough time for them to, undertake the various physical actions they wanted to. So it was it was an information campaign that was linked to a physical campaign as well, in that sense. That kind of paved the way for certain types of action, whether it's annexing Crimea or kind of controlling and sponsoring separatist forces in eastern Ukraine. So that's kind of what, that's what it was aimed at. I mean, you mentioned an interesting thing. One of the things I realized during my book, which I then realized what a terrible wasted opportunity had happened, was while Russia sees Ukraine and Syria as one continuum, they see this as one long conflict, and they actually think in a very expansive way about the battlegrounds that they operate on. They're quite famous for that. They will think about the Baltics and Ukraine and Syria as part of one large front. And America actually, and their involvement in America. We see these as very disparate things. Right. We see the Russian campaign in the American election as one thing, and Russia and the Baltics is another thing, and Russia and Ukraine as a third thing, and Russia and Syria as a seventh thing. And they see it as one thing. And what had been very sad is when I realized that Ukrainians and their supporters fighting their conflict with Russia, whether in the information or the kinetic space, were hardly in touch with Syrians. I remember asking Syrians, like, are you meeting with Ukrainians? You're actually involved in one war, and I mean, I guess they were too busy, and it was
sure. Yeah.
But nobody had brought them together. I think it only happened actually when nobody in the West had brought them together either. I think it only happened when people who were kind of involved in the White Helmets realized the White Helmets were under attack and started looking at, okay, how did the Ukrainians deal with this sort of disinformation? I think that was the first time. And I think that was a huge tragedy, because it's one war and it's one meta-narrative for Russia. Because if there's one meta-narrative the Russians are pushing in their information war, it's that the desire for democracy leads to war and destruction. They're still battling, and maybe now winning, what they perceive as their loss in 1989, which is, the great idea that more democracy equals more prosperity. So their big story in Ukraine, there are a lot of mini stories, but there's one big story, which is the Ukrainian revolution. The desire for democracy leads to war and destruction. They have one narrative in the Middle East. The desire for democracy leads to war and destruction. Their big lesson being, don't desire democracy. Democracy is bad for you. What you want is authoritarianism. It's one story they're trying to tell, and they tell it over and over and over and over again.
And this model works very well for governments like the Egyptian government or the governments in the Gulf, obviously the Syrian one. And this is also something that I feel has been. First, let me just say first that I completely agree with you on the missed opportunities. It's something that I started discovering when I started meeting up with groups in London, like Syrian groups in London. There were a very small number of Ukrainians who sometimes would appear in some of our events. But as far as I know, maybe I'm just missing out, but as far as I know, no real big attempts has really been done to connect the two.
But even civil society funders who were supporting them, I don't think ever saw this as one thing. It's like, because look, activists are too busy sometimes to do anything. They're just too busy surviving. But this, somebody could have started bringing them together. No, I think it goes all the way through. We see these as a set of siloed conflicts, while the Russians don't. For the Russians, this is one great war on democracy.
Yeah. There's a question that, I'm sorry, to kind of take us back to the earlier part of this conversation, but I forgot to ask it. Because I think you mentioned once that Putin actually went after the television stations even before going after the military and the energy sectors, right? Okay, that's very interesting.
Yeah. So one of the first things that Putin does when he gets into power is go after the TV channels, and they were controlled by, frankly, not very nice oligarchs, Gusinski and then Berezovsky, and he goes after them very early. You've got to understand, he's matured in the 1990s. He's seen how transformative television was in Russian politics. 1996, television saved Yeltsin when he looked that he was about to lose. And then he knows it from himself. He's a nobody when he's made prime minister in 1999. Like, he has no charisma. And he's really built up through a very powerful and successful propaganda campaign in 2000 to become this kind of warrior president. I mean, he starts a war as well, which is always helpful if you want to position yourself as a warrior. But it's very much a war that's played out on TV. I don't know, he's constantly going down to the front. This is in Chechnya, and showing what a great war leader he is. And so he knew from himself that TV had made him. And yeah, one of the earliest things that starts happening is he goes after the Kursk disaster, where he's criticized for letting a Russian submarine sink and then not rescuing the sailors. He's criticized very hard by the TV channels, and that's when he goes after them. And that's something that he does before he goes after the oil companies, or he goes after a real sort of really grasping the various power ministries, which happened a bit later. He saw television as absolutely critical to power. It's a very propaganda-driven regime. I mean, it's not my line, it's by a Russian media professor who sort of always jokes that Stalin was 75% violence and 25% propaganda, and Putin is the other way around. He's 75% propaganda and 25% violence. You do need the violence, by the way. You need to arrest people. You need to have show trials. You need to show hard power. I mean, without all those things, the regime wouldn't function. But compared to the Soviet regime, it's almost, it's quite soft towards its own population. In the grand scale of Russian atrocities.
Sure.
But having said that, the war in Chechnya, the kind of obliteration of civilian houses in Putin's war in Chechnya was actually also a clue about how he would behave in Syria.
Exactly. And for those who don't know, about kind of exemplifying a bit more the whole one front thing that you mentioned, is that I think it was one of the, I don't remember, it was one of those Twitter accounts. It was either like one of the Russian embassies, like the South African one or the British one of those, one of the official ones. And they were actually, it was during the time of the bombing of Aleppo, they put a photo of Grozny before and after the bombings, and sort of just saying that, don't you want that for Aleppo? Like, don't you want Grozny to be quote unquote being rebuilt after the destruction? Obviously omitting the fact that they are the ones who did the destruction.
Yes.
The same was being said about Aleppo. And I remember just commenting at the time, like, if only we had any indication of what it is we should expect out of the Russian bombardments of Aleppo. I mean, the Russian government has really just been saying it as openly as they could, I guess. And part of how, I suppose, building on what you said, part of how they've managed to do that is to actually rely on the fact that there's so much noise and disinformation out there that they can say something, but then they can even contradict it a half an hour later, and we wouldn't be none the wiser. Or at least that sort of seems to be the rule book here.
And also using the same lines about they're all terrorists, that kind of all that language was familiar.
Of course, and they showed like Osama bin Laden winning the Oscars when the White Helmets won. There was that documentary that won the Oscars, and I mean, in some ways it's old school propaganda. It's kind of like the quote unquote war on terror narrative in some ways. Well, not in some ways. It's literally that. I wanted to you mentioned this concept of pop-up populism, and I think you actually mentioned this in the interview with Maria Resa, and it was rather than in ideology, so rather than populism being this ideology, it became more of this method or this strategy that's born out of this of the reality of social media. So can we kind of talk a bit about pop-up populism and why specifically social media, which is kind of like the elephant in the room, obviously in this whole disinformation conversation. Why has there been such a big problem? And I know this is a multifaceted question with lots of answers, but as much as you can, why social media specifically? Why Facebook specifically? And how have their model been so easily hijacked? I shouldn't even say hijacked, because in some ways it was designed to be that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think social media has turbocharged a process that was already, which I've seen happening in other markets without social media. I think social media turbocharges it. So basically, look, I'm not, political scientists have a lot of discussions about what populism is and isn't, and we'll leave them in their wonderful conference room arguing about it. And it goes on forever, this conversation. Yeah. I've been to so many of these events. And that's fine. That's what political scientists do. But in my book, I talk to spin doctors, the people who create campaigns. They're not too fussed with political science. Mm-hmm. They're talking about what works. How do you get to an audience? And in one of my sort of favorite chapters of the last book, I talked to a whole bunch. I talked to guys who worked in Russia in the 90s. I talked to guys who create what we think of as populist campaigns in Latin America, in Britain as well, in Brexit. And look, the way they look at it is this: you don't have concepts of left and right anymore. Mm-hmm. You can't just appeal to the left. A lot of the sociological categories that used to exist have gone. Working class, middle class, even a lot of the whole professions have disappeared in the last few years. Mm-hmm. Let's call it globalization, but it's created this flux where the old ways you used to define a society as a sociologist and as a campaigner, they've gone. Mm-hmm. I remember meeting a bunch of campaigners who are trying to use psychographics to define society, so psychological groups, or everyone has got their own little way of doing it now. But what is important is the fact there are so many different ways shows how fluxy and how in movement everything is. Mm-hmm. The old political language is gone. I mean, what the hell does conservative mean anymore in America or Britain? Is Trump a conservative? I mean, all of this stuff is out the window. And you have a challenge as a spin doctor. You need to, instead of thinking in ideological terms of left and right, instead of thinking of clear sociological terms, you've got to find a way of really finding what different groups care about, and reaching them and persuading them that, you can deliver that thing for them. So, the guy who ran the Brexit campaign said, his job is to look up different interest groups online, different Facebook groups, and try to get a different message to each of them, and then persuade them that, getting out of the EU is what solves their problem. So it could be animal rights, mm-hmm. So you tell the animal rights people, the EU is horrible to animal rights. Or there's the immigration people who say, look, well, the EU is horrible for immigration. Or there's mm-hmm. the people who want immigration from India saying, we'll give you immigration from India as long as we get out of the EU, mm-hmm. and so on and so forth. These groups don't have a lot in common. You don't want all these, this is not centrism, where you want to gather different people in a room. You're doing very different messages to different people. And then you have to kind of bundle them all together. You need some sort of vague concept to bundle them all together. And the people, or the majority, or the many, becomes this big empty thing that everyone can imagine their own version of what it is into. And then you need the non-people. You need the enemy, the EU, the establishment, the elites, who become the evil thing that's stopping the satisfaction of your desires. And that's what I mean by pop-up populism. I mean, actually, one of the best examples is in Italy, Cinque Stelle, 5 Star, which didn't even start as a political party. It started off as a bunch of niche blogs. There was one blog quite racist. Another blog would be very, very liberal. Another blog would be about Italy's problem with pollution or trash. So there was this utter mix of completely different blogs, but all united under one media umbrella, and all united by a feeling of frustration, a feeling of left behind, etc., and a feeling that there's a corrupt, broken system that we have to change. And that's how these campaigns work. They don't hold together for very long. They're very good to get people involved in an election, to win an election, because you can access so many different groups.
Mm-hmm.
They usually struggle to govern. When they govern, they usually have to constantly be in campaign mode. So Trump has been in campaign mode nonstop for 4 years. He's in charge of the country for 4 years. He's still fighting the establishment. It's absurd, Yeah. Brexit as well, really, Johnson really struggles when there's a real policy issue to deal with. So he's constantly trying to get this culture war going, that he's representing, Britain's freedom from the shackles of the EU. So they're not very good at governing, these guys, but they can. It's good for campaigning on social media. But I think social media exacerbates this because it encourages campaign managers to think in very tailored ways about small groups that they need to hit with the right message. So it's made this stronger. But in a weird way, in my book, I interview people from Hizb ut-Tahrir, and they told me how they would do something very similar as well. They were also trying to, get disaffected Asian youth in Britain to join Hizb ut-Tahrir. Again, for each young person, sort of finding a different message, and then bringing them into, the idea of the Ummah and a different kind of political Islam, which is also a sort of a populist idea. Mm-hmm. Certainly the way they were doing it. And I've seen something very similar emerge in Russia in the 1990s, when, going back to the start of our conversation, when all the old social categories and all the old political metaphors died and ideologies died. You have this process of trying to create a new idea of the Russian people. Mm-hmm. And it ends up with this idea, which is the main kind of political idea in Russia, of the Putin majority, the Putinskaya большинство, that there is a Putin majority out there, that Putin represents this majority. What this majority is constantly changing. What this majority wants is constantly in flux. It's been many things over the last 20 years, but it exists almost like a very, very oppressive metaphor that's, is constantly being created and recreated, and which kind of replaces the nation. Certainly replaces the public, instead of a public full of different interests and ambitions and debate, you have an almost mystical majority that Putin almost mystically represents. So that's what I mean. And it's very, it's not dissimilar to the populisms or the work with the masses that Hannah Arendt describes in The Origins of Totalitarianism. She actually describes a very similar process in Germany in the 1920s and 30s and the Soviet Union. But what is new now, I suppose, really is this social media aspect, which means that these little bubbles form and then they fall apart, and they form and they fall apart. And, we really have to find a different way of generating political meaning, because I don't think it's sustainable, this thing. And it's always very aggressive by definition.
Didn't Dominic Cummings, who's for those who don't know, one of the architects of Brexit, I suppose, didn't he actually cite one of the, who was he, one of the spin doctors from Russia? Didn't he actually cite him as an influence or something?
I don't know if he did that. He quoted my book saying that he was inspired by a guy who I described there called Surkov. But yes, I mean, Cummings is an intellectual as well as a spin doctor. He does a lot of reading. But he's talked about, but even without this kind of, this kind of stuff, I mean, you just look at, in my book, I interviewed actually the digital head of Vote Leave, who's the guy doing specifically the online stuff.
Yeah.
Cummings managed the whole thing. But look, he's given talks about this very openly. The reason they won the campaign was because they could get into micro messaging. They could find very specific messages for different groups. That's just what social media is. That's that's its design. And so naturally, a good campaign manager uses that. But I think there's a deeper, it's also very powerful because of very deep kind of changes in our society, which makes it more fractured and has undermined old kind of ways of making sense of ourselves.
And so on a final note, since we mentioned social media, I know that you've been involved in a lot of in different capacities of trying to tackle the link between disinformation and social media. So how do we combat this disinformation? I know this is like an episode in itself, so
I
as
can do
much
it quickly, don't worry.
awesome. So like how do we tackle combat this disinformation while being mindful of those who might have like genuine concerns over censorship fears and that sort of thing?
Yes, that's a very good question. I think we have to be much more specific when we're talking about, if we're talking about the regulatory side, the freedom, where freedom of expression comes along, we have to become much more specific in what we can and can't regulate.
Sure.
It's completely true that actually regulating content is very, very hard. If it's not clearly illegal speech, like child pornography or explicitly terrorist content, you're in this kind of place where it would be a very slippery slope to start censoring anyone for saying Trump is great, or even saying that, white helmets are terrorists or something like that, which is a lie, but people probably do have a right to lie. But it's people who have a right to lie. And if one person says something stupid, that's not that big of an issue. Democracy can survive one person, saying something stupid. What we're seeing at the moment has not got to do with that kind of speech, which I don't think can be limited particularly. What we're seeing at the moment is, and here's the deceptive bit, is campaigns which disguise themselves as organic speech. Yeah. So you go online and you think something is a real website or a real person, but actually it's part of a botnet in St. Petersburg. That's the problem. So it's deceptive behavior rather than deceptive content, which is the problem. I mean, the essence of the internet is not content creation. That's an old thing. And we have regulation around content creation. The essence of the internet is amplification, distribution, and targeting. That's the bits that need to be regulated. That's the new thing. So it's not a problem if one person says a horrible, nasty, disingenuous thing on the internet. The problem is when it's amplified and pushed to the top of the Google algorithm in a very artificial way, and in a very strategic way. That's what needs to be regulated. So that kind of deceptive and manipulative behavior, these kind of what the platforms called coordinated inauthentic campaigns, they should be regulated against. They should be made illegal. We should be able to understand whether content we see online is organic or artificial. I think anonymity is absolutely fine. One person has the right to be anonymous. I'm not talking about anonymity. I'm talking about mass deception, which is something completely different. And I think we need much more understanding about why we see what we see in our YouTube or why we see what we see in our Google feed. So much more algorithmic transparency, and platforms should probably be liable if they allow their systems to be manipulated. And they should probably have responsibility about doing something about that. So for a long time, going back to Syria, if you went on YouTube and you punched in Syria or white helmets, all you got was Russian disinformation.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think the platforms have a responsibility for seeing who's doing this and why. This was done strategically. It was quite a simple thing. It was just filling a data hole, a data vacuum. Pumping so much disinformation into YouTube that these stories started to come top all the time. I think that the companies do have a responsibility of showing us a mixture, at the very least, a mixture of content when it comes to especially these kind of very controversial issues. So look, that's all about the responsibility of the platforms, where their responsibility kicks in. I'm not saying we should limit people's freedom of speech, but I think the companies have a responsibility to give us a responsible mix of content. And I do think that kind of deceptive behavior can be regulated. And I think troll farms should be legal. I think they should be domestically legal, internationally legal. I just think that sort of behavior has to be legal. I don't think there's any place for it. You can have campaigns, but then you go, this is a campaign, this is a campaign to spread this message. And that this is not, this is not actually, someone pretending to be an eyewitness in Dera. This is actually a guy in St. Petersburg sitting there going, this is part of the St. Petersburg campaign to spread this message. And then you'll treat it differently. So I do think we need a lot more transparency online. So that's a very important part. And hopefully we'll get there, because I do think there's more awareness among policymakers now about what we're talking about here. The first laws that were passed were stupid, even in democracies, like fake news laws. I just think it just doesn't work, apart from being probably illegal when it comes to freedom of expression. I mean, I would love, I often see my friends and sometimes my in-laws, dare I say, perhaps not, theoretical in-laws, post nonsense online. Yeah. And I'd love to call Facebook and say, look, can you take down this post by my granddad or whatever? But it's not going to happen. I mean, like how many billions of posts are there every day? So it's not like you can hold newspapers or publications accountable for their content, but trying to police what people say on Facebook, I mean, it's ridiculous. So I think all these attempts to create kind of fake news laws and disinformation laws and even like hate speech laws without defining hate speech, I think it's probably illegal, and I think it's also just impossible.
And so on that note, is there anything you're working on at the moment that you would like to talk about, or any of future projects on the horizon?
So anyone can visit our website at the London School of Economics. It's called Arena. We're going to have a bunch of new reports out over the next couple of months about what research we've done in Ukraine, a bit later in Hungary, then just some stuff summing up all our thinking. So, if people really want to get into the weeds of how we can respond to disinformation, then, come and have a look and get in touch with me. Awesome. Thank you a lot for your time. Yeah, thank you for letting me rabbit on. My pleasure. All right, mate. Bye.